All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to advanced webinar number one. We are going to do a second advanced webinar, and I am going to do a workshop on power versus heart rate. I know we originally said we were going to cover that as part of tonight, but that's a different good quantitative back and forth discussion we'll have. So we're going to leave that for another, the workshop format. It works so much better. Tonight, we're here to talk about the power of performance. In these advanced workshops, you're always welcome to ask questions. Ask the questions as we go. Namrita and I will monitor them and just be ready to answer them, throughout the process. So put them up there. Sometimes we'll answer them when we see them. Sometimes we know the answer is coming, so we might not. But get your question in, stuff like that. We'll be looking for it. All right. Let's get into this idea of performance. So when we start thinking about winning and you go into and winning can be defined as a lot of things. Your event, you finish, you achieve your goal, you're not last. It doesn't matter. Like whatever your goal is, we consider that winning. But when we start thinking about that achievement, we have to think about how the race was won. And what's happened so much in this year, there's been almost more focus on it than ever before. It's like we think about performance and we're directly relating it to functional threshold power, or FTP. But the reality is, when we think about how the race was won, you probably didn't spend a tremendous amount of time at FTP. You didn't show up the finish line and have your 20-minute test validated and like all the race referees sat around and be like, all right, who was highest? And they like picked one and put you on the podium. As a matter of fact, probably at the finish line, no one really cared. No one knew what your FTP is. No one really cares what your FTP is. The reality is that winning, achieving your goals, is really about this idea of performance. But because now in training and as we've learned to quantify work, we've learned to quantify power, we have this, our brains really like that. Like we love to fixate on numbers and make it all about a number. But the challenge is now in sports performance, and particularly in endurance performance, that quantification is really becoming the reward. And I've answered this a couple of times. I know Lori said it once too. When the measurement becomes the target, it's no longer a good measurement. And that kind of is this over focused on FTP and not thinking about performance as much as we should when we're talking about what are we doing in our training, what are we trying to accomplish, where we're going. And the reality is, you're so much more. Not just you, the human being, which, yes, obviously, but you, the performing athlete, are so much more than your FTP. So, what we want to talk a little bit of tonight is this idea of what is that more? It's kind of cool to say it. The coaches have all said it. And it's like, wow, you're encouraging me. You're just kind of saying, keeping me energized and motivated. But the reality is, when we look at this idea, FTP, it really has become the tip of the iceberg. And it's what we talk about in performance fitness all the time, this simple measurement. And there's other numbers we can use, like, a 5-minute test or a 1-minute test I might put in that same league. But when we look at performance, we need to also talk about durability, resiliency, and skill. And these have become now below the waterline. We're not talking. It's funny. Velo News wrote an article about durability, like the new metric. Yeah, you saw that, didn't you? And it was like we were laughing. Like we've been tracking durability for a really long time. It's been around for 20 years, But the reality is, these things, like everything, it's secular. FTP has been in the sunlight here for 10, 15 years now. And hopefully we start talking about these more, because we're going to start talking about them tonight. So we're going to focus on durability and resiliency. Now, skill, those are things we work on a lot at our base camp lives and stuff like that. But skill also can be mental performance, your mental side also. So that would go under skill. Those are other areas. We're going to talk about durability and resiliency tonight. So durability is really about sustaining power numbers. And resiliency is really about repeating power numbers. Because if we think about this idea, FTP, that's a threshold, it's a marker, it's an anchor. It allows us to make reasonably good projections of training zones. But when we think about performance, it is just one small element. The reality is not only do we need FTP, we need to be able to sustain high level powers. We need to be able to read, because cycling is a dynamic sport. It's an extremely dynamic sport, actually. And you would say, well, Tim, like, what about like ice hockey, or what about basketball or something like that? Those are very dynamic. Soccer, right? Very dynamic. They are and they aren't, right? Because they're way more anaerobic by general nature. Like, look at ice hockey as a whole. Pretty much, if you're on the ice, you're anaerobic. And that's why like a shift is a minute, like is a long shift, because you're anaerobic. If you're playing a lot of sports, team sports, that is generally true. Think about football, same deal. You're resting in between, right? But when you're playing, you're anaerobic. Endurance sports are different. It's something that this durability metric, this ability to sustain power, is really important. So let's start there. Let's dig into durability, and let's start by defining it. And I'm going to ask Namrita to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of it next slide. But what is durability? The time of onset and magnitude, when and how much, of deterioration in physiological characteristics over time during prolonged exercise. So when do we start to decline, and how quickly? Like, how much do we decline? Now, when we think about like, and when you're ever talking about the human body, it's very complex, but what are some of the core mechanisms, Namrita, that are really the drivers of our durability?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, and everyone who's been doing the training so far can feel this and can see this, but it's our aerobic system. It's our ability to take in oxygen and utilize it to make energy. So how does that happen in our periphery? So we've talked about, our ability to deliver the oxygen, but in our muscle, that's where the actual energy production happens, in the mitochondria. So mitochondria are found in slow twitch fibers. They're much more dense. They're also found in oxidative fast twitch fibers, but you can see in your visual there, the red are the slow twitch. That means they're rich in mitochondria and they are very oxidative. They can use the oxygen. So some of us are genetically built for that, with that phenotype of being more slow twitch, and others aren't. And that's okay. But that is one indicator of, someone who is more highly slow twitch will have a longer time to fatigue. Those fibers are by nature more fatigue resistant because they are so oxidative and they can use that oxygen. So the density of the mitochondria, as you say there. Also, muscle glycogen storage. How much energy can you actually store in the muscle? That's important. And how long can it last? So that depletion rate, if it's a pretty slow rate of depletion, that plays in your benefit. You have more glycogen stored energy available to have a harder effort in the tank. So, you have that in your ability at the end of a race.
Well said. Now, let's ask a bigger question, right? Bigger when we go back to this idea of performance. Is it important? This is a great study, and I think this is also a very well done study, which you don't say much these days. And very basically, without getting too much into it, this is a study, this is about 2 years old now. It was done on World Tour pros and regular pros. So they took the best of the professional cyclists and compared it to the rest of the professional cyclists based on their team, the level they were racing at. And when they did statistical analysis of their max power, they actually found no difference. What makes you an everyday good continental entry level pro is the same power. So you could connect that. The study doesn't exactly say this, even though you see their durations here. They basically have the same FTP. So a pro and a world-class pro, they have the same FTP. You know where they found the difference? Durability. the ability to sustain power and produce power after fatigue. There they saw marked differences. And that was the difference of what, and then when you looked at those athletes' performance, those who kind of got into the pro rank but stalled out versus those that went to the world tour and to the real high level, the pointy tip of the spear, they all made the same power. The ones that were great, the top tier ones, could sustain more power and they could reproduce high levels of power with a lot of fatigue in the system. So it is important. As a matter of fact, it's the absolute difference maker at the pointy tip of the spear, and that does trickle down into all different levels. So when we look at durability as a metric, there's two ways we're going to talk to you about how you can measure it. And these are tests you don't traditionally do. I don't do them. I do kind of do them because I like to self-experiment, often much to my chagrin, but I do it to myself. And basically what you're doing is you're warming up, you make a fresh maximum effort, you do a certain amount of work. Now I'm using the physiological term work. You burn a bunch of kilojoules or kilocalories. You ride your bike for a couple of hours, some measurable function, and then you retest that power. The drop, how big of the drop, is one of the key measurements of durability. I can absolutely tell you in working with pro teams that every team, every pro team measures this. Every pro cyclist has to learn to get good at this because your team is going to measure it. And oftentimes it is the process for selection. Are you going to go to that grand tour? Are you going to even make the team? That FTP is very secondary. You would be surprised. Like, it's much lower tested. So I'll give you an example here. I'm working with this younger professional who's riding for a continental team, and he's heading over to Europe. The team's selecting their Euro team for the spring, and he's fighting to make his Euro team. So what does his team director ask him to do about a couple of weeks ago? A durability test. So the way they're doing it, it's all different. I see teams doing different things, and I've done this back in the day since Team Sky. So I've seen like world tour level and the continental level. Their job was to go out, get in warm up, do a couple of sprints, burn 2,750 kilojoules of energy work. So they did a certain amount of work. Once they got to that 27.5, they were then expected to do 3 times 6 minutes at maximal effort. So this athlete basically goes out there, and what they want to know, and this is where it gets tough in these type of tests, is not only they already have a 6-minute max. By the way, I could have said that from here. So he did not do a 6-minute max up here. They're testing it against his previously tested 6-minute max. And to me, if I was the director, I would have put the 6-minute max up here, just saying. But then they want to look at how strong was the first one and how well they cluster. So they're going to not only look at the average. So this athlete goes out, rides that, does 425 watts for each one of these. The average was 425, and it was like 435, and I think this one was like 405, something like that. But then we build a cluster analysis. They want to know how close they can repeat that power for all three. This is one way to do an excellent durability test. I know, a couple of coaches, including myself, and the test that I'll do frequently, not frequently, but consistently with athletes, is I'll have them do the same setup and have them do their 20-minute test here. That doesn't mean I don't 20-minute test them fresh, and I already have that number, but then I'll have them do the 20-minute test here and see what they can really sustain. That's really a clear measurement. There's some different ways to do it, but I think everybody gets the point. The thing is, as everyday cyclists, we don't ever test like this. Like Nimrita and I had the discussion when we were writing training plans for Basecamp this year, like, should we do some of this? Should we introduce it to Basecamp? It's very hard. It's fatiguing. And when you do tests like this, you do not go home happy. You never do. They hurt, right? Because you're already pretty gassed. I mean, 2,700 kilojoules is a fair amount of work. Maybe we should. But if it's something for you, if you want to know what your durability is, if it changes over training, I do mine. I actually do a fatigued 20-minute test pre-base camp. I do one post-base camp. I'm too running in base camp to do one, and I'll do one again later in the summer to find out. So there's ways for you to measure it. So beyond testing and training examples, what about a performance example? Um, I'm gonna tell you a little secret about Rebecca Rush. As we all know, Rebecca Rush is a 7-time world champion, 2-time Hall of Famer, has had a lot of success. She does not have a big FTP. She doesn't have a small one either, don't get me wrong, but she does not have a huge FTP. She has by far some of the most amazing durability I've ever seen. She does not fatigue. She does not drop off power. So like I was able to compare hers against somebody else's performances. Actually, this was from Unbound years ago. I can't even remember the year. I should have written it down. Long story short, I think you get the point. There were women in there with higher, bigger thresholds that she beat, because even though she had an average of about 35 watts less in threshold, she basically didn't drop off. I mean, she just has incredible sustainability. So durability and building durability, for those people like, I might not have the FTP, one of the things I do see in this group as an observation, there's a lot of you that are very durable. You're doing longer events, you ride your bike a fair amount of time, your decline rates are not that bad. Maybe you should go out and measure it and look to continue to improve that. Because look, as we get a little older, or maybe we're not training as much as Rebecca was during this time frame or something like that, you might not have it all to build 20 more watts to your FTP, but building in durability can make a pretty big impact. Now, another way we can measure durability, I'm going to use some fancy WKO charts, but only a couple of them here and there. When you're fresh, we have a power duration curve. In WKO, you can actually just measure it. We have fatigue resistance charting, and you can pick different time range. And these are all the power deranged. We're all power deranged. Your power duration models. And here is fresh. Here is after 500, or these are years, but there's more lines in here. These are the years, but you're seeing it over time, like how much kilojoule, how much fatigue was taken into the system before this power duration curve was drawn. And here you can see it for 20 minutes. So for example, this athlete in 2022, their fresh number was 302, and their peak after 1,000 kilojoules, which is not a lot. I mean, it's not a little either. That's about, well, maybe 2 hours of riding. Went down to 269. So a 30-watt drop for that 1,000 kilojoules. So it's measurable. If you're using WKO, you can measure it now based on your history. So it's sure, jump in there, you can measure it and know it. Again, a good number to know. Elite athletes. So I did this project with Team Sky. It's probably about 2012, 2013. And they not only measured this deeply, then they did your top 5 after 2,000 kilojoules, your top 5 after 3,000 kilojoules, and those had to be in a 98% cluster. Or they didn't even want to talk about putting you on the team. You had to lose less than 5%, and then you had to have 5 performances after 2,500 kilojoules was their number in clustering 98%, meaning you were able to repeat that a lot. That's tough to do. But if you think about the demands of a Tour de France, Grand Tour, you need to be fatigued and be able to repeat and to repeat and to repeat. Now, if we talk about durability, what is the basis? And Namrita just said it pretty well. Your aerobic fitness. There's some other things that correlate, but there's no better correlation between your aerobic fitness, your aerobic endurance. You have aerobic capacity and aerobic endurance. Let's put those together and call them fitness. Then your durability, because if we simply think about how you make energy, we have 3 systems. Here's your very short-term fight or flight energy. Here's your anaerobic energy. And green, this is your aerobic energy, right? We can see here somewhere after about, I don't know if you had to eyeball that, maybe 90 seconds, you're crossing over, whatever it might be. Aerobic energy pretty much is the fuel. Everything after that, that is the dominant source. So the relationship is inverted. Why durability and aerobic fitness are so related? Because without aerobic fitness, you really cannot have a lot of durability. You have to have it. Now, there's other factors, but if you don't have the aerobic conditioning, aerobic capacity and aerobic endurance working together, you're not going to be a very durable athlete. So when you hear this argument about high intensity training all through the winter, or your Zwift racing 5 days a week through the winter, right? And then you kind of get stagnant and you don't improve and you can't sustain. That's why aerobic fitness is the underlying required condition of durability. And to explain that a little deeper and show you examples, something you can begin to look at in your own way, even though looking at it is a little more challenging than it sounds. Let's go back to our stress-strain relationship. Don't worry, I'm not going to cover this. I know everybody remembers it, or I hope you do. We produce power. That's a measurement of stress. I'm doing 300 watts. I'm looking at the external load I'm putting on the system. We are the system. Our heart rate responds, and that's strain. And eventually that strain leads to adaptation. Now, when we look at this stress-strain relationship, we can begin to look and get a deeper insight into our durability based on our aerobic fitness. And we can do this in our aerobic rides, our longer aerobic rides. And for the next 6 weeks, I can't believe we only have 6 weeks left, but for the next 6 weeks, you can use some of your longer rides and you can look at what I'm about to show you, because the workout stress strain relationship is dynamic. And this is the idea of decoupling. So what this means is if you were to ride your bike, and let's just say you were to do 200 watts steady state. Now that's a pretty high endurance number, so maybe I should use 150 watts or 100 watts. You can use your number, whatever it is. I'll use 150 to keep it kind of in between. And I rode a perfect 150 watts, which I stick it in nerd mode, 150 watts. I'm doing that for 3 hours. For a large portion, my heart rate it'll come up a little in the beginning, right? It takes a minute or two to get your heart rate running. But then it will stay pretty steady. The relationship between stress and strain, when we are not fatigued, when we're in the durable state, right, is pretty linear. They'll run hand in hand with each other. As long as I don't change power, my heart rate basically stays the same. Don't get me wrong, it'll go up a couple, it'll go down a little, and there's factors which I'll talk about. But then as you start to ride and you kind of, because this is time, by the way, I should have put that here. As you go longer and longer, you begin to struggle a little bit. Your heart rate begins to be a little less correlated and maybe even a little more erratic. And then usually you can see, and if you're very in tune to your body, you can feel a point where it decouples. And then the stress and strain relationship are no longer linear. They're no longer correlated to each other. And what's happening is strain is going up faster than stress. And that is the tier. And that's exactly, by the way, ta-da, that's why they call it decoupling, because the relationship decouples. Now, if you start looking at a 2-hour ride or a 3-hour ride, you can simply gauge when you decouple. If it's way over here, right? If it's early in your ride, you have low durability. And that tells you, if you took that out on a road, in a race, in an ultra, in something long, you're going to struggle. Because it's not just a problem like, of course, Tim, I'm going to struggle because if I ride 4 hours, I'm going to be way up here. But you're going to struggle in other ways, low muscle glycogen, energy deplete, all the other problems, because this is an indicator. Like, it's not the reason you suffer, even though it will be one of the reasons, but it's an indicator of heart rate. So that is a good look, a good understanding. If it's way out here, it's high durability. So it's like, when I'm working with athletes at this level, and I do this with myself all the time, I don't have a high FTP. I really don't. but I am pretty durable. Like I don't decouple. Today I did a longer trainer ride because my weekend's a little messed up, and I was like looking for that point. I'm like, okay, when am I going to decouple? You can begin to tell. You can actually see even, and of course we can analyze it, and I'm going to show you some samples in a moment here, but you can just see when it happens. And understanding that, and I'm going to also talk about factors. You could be too hot, and that would decouple you. You could be totally fatigued. There's some other factors. So anything with heart rate, you can't trust every day. But the reality is, I know my pattern. I know pretty well from our long Sunday rides and what I'm doing on Wednesday when I'm decoupling right now, and I'm improving pretty well. I came into camp or the base camp in pretty poor shape for me, and I'm picking up fast now. You can use in these steady state rides extended powered heart rate. So, Michael, I saw your question. We want that to be under 3, 2.5 and longer rides. You could actually see here the very linear based relationship between the stress and strain. If you look at it, you can eyeball it pretty well and see. And then you can start looking at sections. So here's the trick, right, Michael? Drag a section to, like, don't catch your warm up, but grab a section out to an hour. What's your powered heart rate? Now from like 15 minutes in to an hour and 15. Then grab a section from 15 minutes in to 2 hours and 15. Did your power to heart rate change? Please don't raise your hand. I'm just going to put it down for you. You can ask a question in the question box. So the reality is, do it from 15 to an hour 15. Do it from 15 to 2 hours and 15, and look to see if those two power heart rates, and then just narrow down to the scope to where you see it really change. The range, you really want it to be under 3%, but understand, once you uncouple, think about what I'm saying. Oh, Namrata, you want to see me make some trouble? Watch this new trick. I don't know if you've used this yet. Look, they gave me a pen. Oh no, everybody be afraid, I can draw. So think about it this way, right? So let's say this is your 15-minute point. Drag that line to an hour and 15, which is kind of this. And you look at the number, and let's say the number is 3. Then you drive it from 15 to an hour and a half, and that number's 4, right? Powered heart rate number. You know some changes happened in here because that little bit more raised the number. So then drag it to a shorter number. Find where that point of change came. Because if you think about it, that not only will give you the number, it will give you the point of when it started to change. Now you have to kind of just drag a couple of intervals if you're going to do it that way. I'm going to show you some better ways in a moment anyway. So it's a simple way to look at it. You want that power to heart rate to be that. Now, remember something I just said a minute ago. You cannot trust heart rate every workout. So you want to do that. Go over and look at your last 10 longer endurance rides on the trainer that have been steady. They have to be steady rides. Powered heart rate only works when it's steady. I already see the question here from Cindy. What happens if that's negative? There's too many variables in heart rate. So you just want to look at a bunch of those over time. Negative can be driven by fatigue. It can be environmental. It could be a couple of different things. Mine often will run negative until it doesn't. It depends on a lot of different things. But powered heart rate is a simple way to see it. Brian, I see your question. I'll come back to it. Another way you can measure it is aerobic efficiency. So if you look at all your endurance rides, and you'd have to do this in a piece of paper or do it in an Excel or a Google Sheets, write down the EF, efficiency, you see it, it's right here, it's a number. Write that down of all your progressive endurance, which you're basically doing every Sunday, things like that, and Wednesday, and see what's been changing. Likelihood over this time, if you're really improving your durability, your aerobic efficiency is going up, because aerobic efficiency gives you insight into the metabolic relationship between heart rate and normalized power, to be specific. That's an excellent understanding of stress-strain relationship. So that should change over time. So Michael asks, are progressive endurance rides not good? No, progressive endurance rides are fine. They're steady. What I mean by steady is they're not like intervals. I did 5 times 5 minutes where the power is going like this, or outdoor riding in a group ride where your power is going like this, right? Steady state rides. Progressive is steady. It steps up at stages. The heart rate should step up accordingly, right, with it. So it is one way you can look at it. Now, progressive will tend to make that look lower, because as you go a little more power, think about as power goes up, right? As power goes up, heart rate goes up more, but then flattens out because you're getting close to threshold or maximal heart rate. Efficiency probably is the better number. If you were to ask me of those two, which to look at, measure the efficiency of all your progressive rides, measure that efficiency, and you'll have a good idea of change over time. Just write the number down, 1.5, 1.2, whatever the number is. I can't see the sample here, 1.7 in this example, which is pretty high. It's a very unique number to you, by the way, so there's no comparing. So if you write that down, let's see, the first couple you did were 1.2, 1.3, 1.2, and now you're doing that 1.5, 1.6. That's a great tell because it takes a bigger picture into play, right? That's a simple way of looking at it. I don't use powered heart rate much, really at all, because there's so many factors. You have to have the right time frame. You have to have the right steady state power. You have to have the right whatever. It's something that efficiency factor is much better. Or better yet, we actually go and look at the drift, right? We do have in the more advanced analytics the ability to actually look at the drift. And what I want to do, I'm running a slope on that drift. I want to understand its rate of increase, because that gives me excellent insight into when that athlete decouples. Like I can drill into that by time segments and figure out when the slope began its real increase. If I look at it over a full workout, at heart rate and whatever, if I'm looking at the full workout, it's a straight line. But if I break that into chunks, I can see, because it's a slope. So if you want since it's advanced, what you're running there is a simple linear regression, which is a fancy mathematical term for the medium distance between 2 points, which we tend to call average, but that's not exactly what it is. So a linear regression math gives us better insight, because linear regression can be broken up much better. It can be segmented much better. It'll give you more insight much better. So if you went through and grabbed a section of this, and this slope was to recalculate, the simple linear regression line would recalculate, you would see exactly when the line went from flat to up. And that's like, hey, there's the decoupling point. There are some ways we can even go deeper with looking at decoupling, but here's the other note, and I said it earlier, and I should have said it better. You should know, you'll know, you've been watching, I was sitting on the trainer today and I'm doing a pretty steady watt, and my heart rate was 13, 115, and it was just there and there and there. And I actually had 2 phone calls and whatever, and it went up like 2 beats, but I'm pretty steady. And then a certain amount of hours in, suddenly it was 117 and 118 and 119, and I had decoupled. It should be something beyond all the fancy analytics that you can see. Now, I want to answer a question that normally comes up when we talk about decoupling. Let's say this, just visualize this, put this in your head for a moment, because the question I always get is, let's say you're targeting heart rate and your target endurance heart rate is 125 beats. Well, your 125 beats, if I was going to keep this flat past decoupling, I have to power down, right? My power would need to come down to hold that 125. And the question I get most of the time is, should I stay at the set heart rate and drop power so my heart rate stays the same, or hold the power and increase your heart rate, or let your heart rate increase? The answer is, most of the time, hold the power and let your heart rate increase. To me, and I've heard varying opinions, this is an opinion, I think reasonably backed by the science, but you need to go make your own decisions on this or do your own research. if you never hold the power, you're introducing the stimuli to improve things like durability. Like if you immediately back down the power when the heart rate goes up, you're never going to adapt to the art of going longer. You're not going to build a durability that way. I mean, there's other systems that will help, and your durability might go up, but you're not going to maximize it, because every time you get to the point where you're beginning to challenge that durability, introduce a stress that should result in the right stimuli, which should result in the specific adaptation, you shut her down. That's wrong. Now, if you have moderate, we have to kind of say low and moderate decoupling, 10 to 15 beats, is the average person, maybe even 5 if you had a really low heart rate. But I would say still 10 to 15, maybe even 20, stay on the power. Now, for some reason, your heart rate's really high. That's an indicator of usually like massive environmental stress or something else like that you need to respond to and slow down. So, and this line is the common sense line. There is a point where like, all right, my heart rate's just crushing. Something isn't right. I'm just struggling. I'm going to do it. But otherwise than that, stay on the power, because that is a key to building durability. Now, a couple of questions came in. Pete asked, how does decoupling relate to TTE? TTE is durability, but a specific durability. So the higher your TTE is, that could be a good measurement of your durability. It's not something I would dismiss, but it's probably too precise, like it's too precision, because TTE, as you're using the term, is how long can you sustain that quasi-steady state, which we call threshold or FTP, right, before you start sustainably dropping off. Like what we politely call it sustainably dropping off, because it doesn't sound very encouraging for us to say, and you ain't coming back. Like I'm off my FTP power and it's not coming back. I'm too tired. So the reality is it is related, and it's one of the indicators and one of the scores of durability, but this is something that often goes later. Now, TTE is known as time to exhaustion. The definition of TTE, or time to exhaustion, is how long can you sustain power at FTP before you start dropping off, before it's like, oh boy, I'm done. Like that's as tired as, and for most human beings, that could be anywhere from like 30 to 70 minutes. So 30 to 70 minutes. Okay, just looking. The difference between stamina and durability. So stamina, again, is an element of durability, but it's a measurement. So stamina is how much you're dropping off power after an hour. So that's a rate of decline. So it's related, and all these things, TTE, durability, decoupling, right? How long can you stay coupled might be a better way of saying, put all them together and you have your durability. So they're all individual pieces and parts of durability. Now, when we start thinking about this idea of decoupling, because remember, this is the aerobic fitness part that we're talking about. We start talking about this, always remember there's some factors that will dramatically impact your heart rate. That's why any number we're using, power to heart rate, we just got to be a little grain of salt. We have to understand the environment. Heat, cold, humidity, things that impact us, your hydration status. So many cyclists just don't drink enough when they ride. And later in rides, your heart rate's going up or going down because of your hydration status and your fueling status. You have to have those right to really be able to trust the numbers too. I'm just looking at any. Greg, I'm going to get to your question. So how do we improve durability? 3 training factors correlated with improved durability. So Nimrita, what's some thoughts? What's some ideas about improving durability?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's really when you look at what is causing fatigue, it's the additional recruitment of more muscle fibers and motor units as you start getting into that domain of like producing more lactate. I think of that as a proxy for fatigue. So the longer you can delay that, the better. So what does that mean? It means spending a lot of time working on your aerobic system. So like you say here, time spent below your first lactate threshold, below tempo, basically, that will help. That'll help you extend the amount of time you can go before you're tapping into those more fatiguing mechanisms, basically. Increasing the polarization of intensity distribution, again, keeping your easy days easy. And this is something we say all the time, is not chasing those watts on your endurance days for that reason. And that allows you, when we get to repeatability or resiliency later, you'll see why. It'll allow you to go hard when you need to go hard and recover from those efforts. And then allowing you to, the more you can train at these more aerobic intensities, allows you to train more, provided you have the time. So you can maximize that. And effectively, you're giving yourself a higher training load, which you really need if you want to be a durable athlete.
Agreed. So let's take a look at quick of these. One question I'll answer. Michelle asked, wouldn't heart rate go up with dehydration and low fuel? Yeah, that's typically a response you would see. But if you match that with high fatigue, you're going to see some erratic response from your cardiovascular. Your heart, you have a bunch of defensive systems in you that if you trigger those defensive systems, you'll be surprised at the oddity. But typically in hydration, dehydration, low fuel, you'll see a higher increase. Your stroke volume gets lesser. So your heart beats a little faster to make up for it. Just taking a look at these three, I'm going to speed through these slides and we'll jump into resiliency. Just spending time between LT1. We've actually talked so much about moving this over, moving that LT1. That's a huge builder of durability. So a lot of times in the first 2 cycles of base camp, you're like feeling better, you're riding better. We're not really pushing FTP. As a matter of fact, we're sort of pushing your durability and we're setting the stage for all these performance elements, and you feel better and you're more sustained and you're getting through workouts easier and other stuff. Maybe your FTP has only moved a little bit. That's intentional. We're putting the time and the work in there and the aerobic fitness to build. The point about polarized approach, like one of the things that some research has showed is the benefits of taking a polarized approach towards training. It actually has greater impact on your durability. The thing is, when we say polarized, that means everything is really hard, everything's really easy. That's not where the current science is falling out. Let's just say some sort of hard and easy, and that's 2 to maybe 3 hard days a week. We follow generally a polarized event. We use a 2.5 polarized for everything but the beginner plans, which are 2 polarized. Now, we don't do high intensity days on the hard days. We're doing tempo and SST work, but they're still following that same type of progression because that change from higher moderate intensity to lower intensity to moderate intensity triggers durability response. What I believe it's giving you, and I hate saying this with my physiologist partner here, is in a simple way, greater metabolic flexibility. Like that ability to go hard and burn some different fuels and go easy and burn some different fuels. Your metabolic flexibility improves in polarized training, and I do believe that supports greater durability. I'm a huge believer, as you can see, in cadence versatility, metabolic flexibility. Teach your body everything before you specialize in something. And finally, more training. It's just well known. Aerobic fitness, as training load goes down, durability goes down. It has a strong correlation to progression. So you'll see some of the greatest endurance gains. Like this is a base camp athlete. Here you see the 4 cycles of base camp, how it looks in a PMC when you do 100% of the workouts. You'll see some of the greatest gains during the ramp up. And once you get high, it will likely not continue to improve, even though we tend to think, well, we're still training hard, we have a high CTL load. This is where the stimuli and response are happening. And it's a little different timed for everybody, but it's happening during that increase. So that really relates to building durability. And if you think about it, you see the pattern, like what we're talking about and like what it takes to build. And when we laid this out in cycle 1, we said there were other performance factors that we want to work on. Your plan has a couple of elements of durability built into it. Now, we can't do it all, the group training and this and that. It can be more individualized to you in a one-on-one coaching scenario, but you have the elements built in. Now, a couple of key workouts because I'm already behind schedule significantly. Here's one, progressive endurance, and just look at where your heart rate is at the beginning of each step and at the end of each step. You'll begin to see it. You'll start noticing when you really, even though, remember, you're going more power, so it should go up at the step, but then just see where it decouples. But another trick, and we've been doing this, and you're seeing a couple of these, and you're going to see a steady dose of them, and particularly in the next couple of weekends and stuff like that, we're using fatigue resistant format. So this is a fatigue resistance format, my naming. And basically we're putting the intervals at the end. And what that means is you're not going to produce quite the same power because you're going to get in X amount of kilojoules of work in advance, but we're putting you into a pre-fatigue status on a purpose, because then performing in that pre-fatigue status has, not to get too into the complexity of it, but there's a specific, we're creating a specific stimuli, and we expect a more specific response, greater muscle glycogen storage, better resistance to fatigue, hence the name. Other elements are in play there. Then at times you'll also see occasional work, and this is when you're mature, like when you have athletic maturity and you've been training a lot, parabolic workouts. Parabolic is just a fancy name for a shape like a smile face, like this, like a very flat U, where you're doing work in the beginning and work in the end, harder work, moderate or harder work. And if you think about it, like that's a lot of races right there. Like that's what they look like when you think about it. Now, obviously, this is in nice little squares and intervals, but that's what parabolic is doing. You work hard, you're doing intervals hard up front, then you're getting a fair amount of aerobic, you're building aerobic fitness, and then you're working in the end. That has a very high demand, has very big impact on teaching your body muscle glycogen storage, other advantages there to improve your durability. So in the end of the day, the basis of durability is just good, a lot of time below LT1, good endurance ride. Progressive endurance helps because you're following the same principle, just getting a little harder. Instead of starting out really hard here, like our local group rides, we all go out of the parking lot at 500 watts for the first 20 minutes. And then by the time we come home, we're going 100 watts, right? We're reversing that and teaching better habits. Before we go on to resiliency, which is shorter, I promise. Any final questions about durability? Brian, I saw your chat about training metabolic fitness to keep the power the same. Absolutely. That's exactly what you're doing. Greg, DFRC is going to get covered here. All right, let's jump into resiliency. I'll define it. Resiliency is the athlete's ability to repeatedly perform bouts of high intensity work over time. And that is typically known as anaerobic work capacity, or AWC. In WKO, we call it FRC, functional reserve capacity, but the physiological term is known as anaerobic work capacity. And it's not only the fact that we're measuring that anaerobic work capacity, we have to have some insight into the recharge rate, which we're going to get into. But let's start with this idea of anaerobic work capacity, AWC, which this is a critical power model, refers to that as W. So Namrita, tell us a little bit about AWC or W.
Yeah, so it's easiest to kind of look at this chart, and it is a critical power model, but you can substitute FTP and get the same idea. So that dotted line you see around 300 watts would be, call it your FTP, or here critical power. It's basically the power that you can sustain for, let's call it at least 30 minutes, 30 to 70 minutes or so. And then that curved line above it that you see going up towards 1,000 is basically in the model, the work capacity or the AWC that you have available to you when you are at work rates above 300 watts or your FTP or critical power. So that would be, again, called AWC, but you also see it W prime a lot. So what we're really saying is, very simply, you as a person have a capability of producing a fixed amount of work when you are riding above your threshold or your FTP. And think of that if you think about your aerobic system. So when you're under threshold, think of that as your aerobic engine that we've been building. But sitting on top of that literally is this like anaerobic battery. That's a like kind of an oversimplification, but if you just think about it that way, that battery has a charge and it will be depleted. So whatever, your capabilities are, your battery has, less or more. Tim's has way more than mine, for example. I have what I have, but the discharge, you can measure that. And we'll show you how you can see it. The thing is when you're riding over your threshold, this battery will deplete or discharge at different rates depending on how hard you're actually riding. So if you're at 350 watts and your FTP is 300, you'll have a slower discharge rate. You'll deplete it slower because you're just over your threshold. But if you're all of a sudden going, 700 to 800 watts, then you can see how that would be more anaerobic demand and your battery's going to deplete a lot faster. So there's definitely different things that go into how long you can sustain. So this one actually shows nicely here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody,
Yeah.
Nobody's stuck with me turning her slides. So.
Yeah, no, this is fine. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. So 30 seconds here. You see the stars. There's a 30-second point on this model, a 3-minute point, and then a 10-minute point. So if you are looking at the 10-minute point, your battery will last a lot longer. It'll last 10 minutes if you're just at, 300 and whatever, 40 watts. But now if you're at 400 watts, you can sustain that for about 3 minutes before your anaerobic battery or your W prime is empty. Again, if you're just going for 30 seconds, then these are max efforts. You can sustain more watts, but for not as much time before you start to fatigue. So that's kind of the idea of that battery. If you want to think about it in that concept, it's easier to understand, I think, knowing that you have just a fixed amount available, and when it's gone, it's kind of gone until you begin to recharge it. And we'll talk about that next.
Yeah, so once you burn it down, right, and the battery's empty, I will tell you, and just to make this clear, as Namrita can walk us through the recharge, and we'll probably have a little discussion about this because here's where things get gray and fuzzy. Once your battery is depleted, your anaerobic, you're gonna go under FTP. Like physiologically, it's gonna happen. Like I know we have this, like somehow we're gonna rip open our jacket and our Superman t-shirt's going to be on and somehow we're going to sustain that. No, you're not. When the battery is empty, the only thing you can do is you must get you have to go under FTP to allow that battery to recharge. You simply cannot make fuel that way anymore. Now, sure, you might have had an extra 5-10 seconds in you with good mental toughness, but physiologically speaking, when the battery is empty, it's empty. But then under FTP, we begin recharging. So what's your thoughts on recharging? We could probably have a 1-hour discussion here, but give me your thoughts and I'll give you some.
Yeah. So, I mean, the battery itself and the discharge is pretty straightforward, right? With that model, the recharge is more complicated. And I think it really depends on whether you're doing steady state or doing intervals here is probably the easiest way to think about it. So you're doing, let's say 30-second max effort anaerobic capacity intervals. You have a recovery interval in between there. Everyone is going to recharge their battery. I'll just use that term going forward now at a different rate. And it's going to depend on a lot of different things. But at the very core of it, the recovery intensity and then the recovery interval duration are the two main points there before we go into individual factors. The thing is exactly what you said, that interval of recovery intensity, no matter how long it is, it needs to be below your threshold. Otherwise, you're not going to be regenerating any of that work capacity, anaerobic work capacity.
Yeah, and recharge, the burn down rate is pretty much not subject to a lot of variables. I mean, you can kind of just get after it, and whatever's in the battery, you're going to be able to burn down. This is also very subject to variables. How fatigued are you overall? Like, are you totally in the 21st day of a deep cycle? Are you well nutritioned? the environment has impact on recharge. It's harder to recharge, you're much slower to restore in stressful environments, high heat, high altitude, things like that. And finally, there's something, Emery and I had a brief chat about this today, which we could have put here. There's fatigue plays a role, and there's a slow component element which negatively impacts your recharge rate. So the further out you're into a workout, the slower your recharge rate will naturally be. And finally, the burn rate, how we burn doesn't vary from human much to much. The recharge rate varies from human to human a lot. So when we begin to try to model things like this is the critical power model of W, we understand the burn rate pretty well. Nobody's been able to accurately predict the recharge rate. We've done some okay enough work, but there's just too many variables. So the place where these things can be a little bit wonky is depending on where you're at, your environment you're training in, your physiological status going into that training, and how fatigued you are in that actual workout. Those are all impacting numbers. Now, there is a recharge relationship to the size of the battery. So we typically will measure the size of your anaerobic work capacity in kilojoules. It's not a watts number. It's not 800 watts or 1,000 watts. It's kilojoules, which gives us an insight into the amount of energy we can burn. Now, 1 watt is a joule per second. There's a time element here, right? So basically, a watt and a joule are the same thing. A kilojoule is a bunch of joules, 1,000 of them actually. So if you have 10 kilojoules of anaerobic work capacity, you could actually translate that into a watt number and how many you can burn. Now, what we do know, and we have seen, and I've done a fair amount of research in this and creating a model, the larger your battery, so the higher that kilojoule your anaerobic work capacity number is, or your FRC number is, the faster it will generally recharge. The double struggle for people who have smaller or anaerobic work capacities is they recharge slower to boot, because the systems they don't have a lot of the mechanisms they're not very anaerobic. They don't have that big battery, and they don't have the mechanisms to recharge it as well. So there is a relationship between the size. Now, I think I answered 2 questions right there. So let's talk about some of the resilience factors, Namrita. I mean, these next 2 slides are opinion. As a matter of fact, Namrita and I chatted a little bit about it today. I'm not even end of the day 100% sure we're on the same page, because this isn't a hard science. Namrita and I didn't spend the day in the lab cutting up lab rats and drilling biopsies on people and stuff like that. This is more of seen a lot of data, give you some insights into what's driving the factor of that resiliency.
Yeah. Although lots of people have offered biopsies, but we're not there yet.
I know we have plenty of volunteers. We haven't had a shortage until you do one.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm done. Never doing that again.
Yeah. I mean, so here we're specifically talking about resiliency. So how many times can you repeat those hard efforts and, use up those matches and regenerate? So part of it, like you said, and you gave a number to it, 40% of that, what goes into someone's resiliency is the size of their battery. So, the actual work capacity that they have, the number of kilojoules. Again, yours would be probably twice the size of mine. And that's trainable again. So, to some degree. So of course your phenotype and your fiber type is going to make a difference here. But when you are specifically doing anaerobic capacity training and you're training that system, you can improve it. You can improve your ability to generate more power and to do it repeatedly and recover. But again, you can't really talk about that without talking about the battery recharge rate. So that there's so much, anyone can go do like a few random max efforts, but how many people can actually recharge in between and repeat those numbers, like you say, in that cluster and not decline? that again is probably even more individualized. It's situational in that if you're fatigued, you're going to have a harder time. And yeah, it totally depends. I do think this is trainable, and I'll explain why. And going back to that individual component, so some of the reasons why it's individual is some people have over time lower phosphocreatine restoration. They have higher pH that takes longer to deal with. So the acidity in the muscle, that's what you're feeling. You're not feeling lactate, you're feeling that acidity after those hard efforts. If you're more fatigued or you have a higher percentage of type 2 fibers, your muscular efficiency might not be as high as you go in, later to a workout and you have to do a bunch of repeated hard efforts. There could be changes to your muscle contraction and the efficiency of that in the excitation contraction coupling, and that involves calcium and all those things. So there's also your aerobic system plays a huge part in this recovery from the intervals. So remember, you have to go below threshold. That means your aerobic. So the better your aerobic capabilities and your oxygen delivery and your mitochondria and all of the things that go into healthy mitochondria, like antioxidant capabilities and things like that. All of those are very individualized, but they do tend to improve with aerobic / endurance training. And so that's why I do think that recharge rate is trainable. But I think it would more be trainable with the aerobic work, whereas the FRC and the size of the battery over on the left of your screen would be more trainable with the actual interval work and chasing those high watts.
Yeah, I agree. That was all so well said. I'm glad we recorded that. That was really good. And again, stresses the importance that this is an aerobic sport, damn it. Like we could be talking about all of this and it really, and we said this a couple of times, I'm not sure everybody grasped it, but maybe now's the moment to say it again and grasp it. The higher aerobic fitness you have, the better you recover. Two reasons. One, you don't have to drop as much power. And the second is the fact that that is the part of the mechanism, right? And it's so important because you understand that the same part of that is the same thing that's making you good at it is also what's driving your rapid recovery. I agree. I don't have anything to add. That was awesome. Big battery, faster recharge rate. You're a very anaerobic athlete, right? So here's just a tip, a coaching tip. That makes you the most dangerous person to yourself out there because you have big battery and the ability to go big. You can put yourself in a deeper hole too. Rarely ever do you see an athlete with a lower FRC, a big aerobic engine athlete, can really bury themselves to where they struggle to function on the bike. High, big anaerobic work capacity athletes, the damage you can do to yourself, you can blow yourself up in event after event, race after a race, because you can. Because even though you have that big battery and your charge is right, you're more dependent on it. You burn it down. So it's a double-edged sword. Be careful with it. How do we measure? Critical power is just the space above the FTP or the critical power line. It's the space in here, and I'm ready to explain that. We have functional reserve capacity in WKO5, which is just a number. I'm actually showing a chart of glycolytic capacity, some other aspects of it. I don't want to get too complex, even though it's advanced. There are questions that we can answer and stuff like that. The reason we call it functional reserve capacity in WKO is even when you're in critical power, this is your anaerobic. This is a measurement of your anaerobic energy, but you're still breathing. You're still having some aspect of oxygen, of utilizing a little bit of air. It's small, it's tiny, a little bit of fatty acid, fats as fuel, very tiny. But it has a small impact. So we just called it functional because it's the power you can really do above. Now, let's give some visuals examples of this. I've used this in a workout review, and I've given everybody a few reviews to see on this. And I have a feeling I received the questions that have been here to some degree. So that's a good question. I'll go back here. Does this data translate to both men and women athletes, or there are differences? I've done some good big study data on them. There's differences in the raw number. Men tend to have a good bit higher anaerobic work capacity because they'll be a little more fast twitch muscle. Their fiber types will be a little more gender specific in that sense than women. And so they tend to have a higher, if you like, look at a mean max out, look at all the norms, they're higher. The rest is very similar. The rest is very similar. So it really is more about fiber type than gender, but yet men will tend to have a higher fast twitch fiber type as a whole. So exactly what do you want to say, chicken and an egg there might be the way to look at it. That's the difference. The ability to predict and impact and to create a model based on that is not impacted by gender at all. Then you're going to ask me about age, so I might as well tackle that one. Yeah, age impacts it. It goes down as we get older. Keep training and doing hard stuff and challenging yourself every day, and we slow that decline. There's the age answer. Because it is measured, it's modeled to you. So when we look at it, like here's power in a workout. Here is your DFRC. So this is your FRC, or your anaerobic work capacity being measured. The D is dynamic, in a dynamic fashion, using a model to estimate the battery burn down, recharge, burn down, recharge. And this athlete is doing a workout called crit sprints. And you can see they do a couple of warm-up efforts, they burn it down, they get into this sprint. I'll show you what it is in a second. Then they burn down, they burn down, they burn down. Now, because it's a model, it can go below zero sometimes. It's never a perfect, and it depends, the athlete needs to be well tested and stuff. But if you look at this, you can see these efforts were, taking things down. Now, if we drill in on the efforts a little more, just picking some of the ones in the middle, we can really see what this athlete is doing is a short sprint, short rest, short sprint, short rest, short sprint. And even in the little short rest, you get that little bit of recovery, but you see this kind of lightning stroke. That is one of the highest demand anaerobic stress, like we can put on like a workout that is really punching at that anaerobic work capacity. Because in this case, it's driving this athlete a little below zero. And the only thing there is just don't worry about if it goes one below. It's just a model isn't always going to be perfect because we understand the down rate well. As we said, it's this recharge rate. That's just a little different. So you don't know that 1 minute of rest exactly how much you're really recharging. It's hard to tell. So we can see this, and it's not just how low can you go, but how many times can you go low? You see it in this athlete, what's happening to them, right? Because there's other elements of fatigue. They could go low these first two, but here, and you can see it in the power's going down. They're running out of steam, right? The battery's dead. It's not recharging quite to the height. They have to begin. They're just not ready to go for another round. Now, when we think about this in performance, we tend to think about this as matches. A match is a hard effort over FTP. We use this all the time. And we say, how big is the athlete's match book? That's anaerobic work capacity. That's resiliency in old school terms. We can measure in advanced analytics again. Like here's a chart, race matches. We can look at what matches they burned, how many, and what was the cost. And we can even look at it in heat mapping efforts. So there's ways we can drill into that. So now I gave you some test formats for durability. I'm going to give you my go-to test format, and I'll show you a result here real quick on testing resiliency with athletes. So this is what I call anaerobic or AC crit sprints. And all it really is, and I zoomed in on one interval to give you an idea, and you're all welcome to steal this. Don't give it away though. Try this test. It's lovely. You'll really enjoy it. You do 10 seconds as hard as you can. Rest for a whole minute. Hey, take the minute. 20 seconds as hard as you can. Rest for a minute. 30 seconds as hard as you can. Rest for a minute. 40 seconds. Rest for a minute. 50 seconds. Rest for a minute. And then finish it off with a minute. I mean, look, you got all this rest. right? Just try that. So the way we test this with, and then you get 10 minutes in between, and then you repeat another. And basically when I do it as a test, I'll just put like 6 on here, and I just want the athlete to go until they crack. So they can't do any more, because that gives you excellent insight into repeatability, because you're doing what's happening real quick is this 10-second interval 20, we're doing variable anaerobic demand lengths, but we're really lighting you up. We're pulling that, and that's what you're seeing here, by the way. We're pulling that down. We're really depleting, because these are the downside of looking at it in structured workouts is they all look the same effort, right? Like the athlete's going the same as hard. Each one is max. So when you look at it actually executed, here's it executed and what I'm looking for. So you can see here that the early ones is the athlete's on it, like, I'm going to crush this. And then, because, you get that long 1 minute rest, you'll be fine. And, suddenly it's like, holy crap, this is getting hard. Because what those really hard 10-second and 20 seconds, because you go higher intensity, remember what Namrita said about higher intensity, you're drawing down a lot of that workload. So then you just tend to drop off. And then what I'm looking for is the number of intervals they finish. So each one of these is an interval. So this would be 3. And then I'm comparing the rate of decline. And I'm not using the right term of what I do, but I triangulate those. Like some athletes can only do 3, but their decline rate's a little better. Some athletes can do 4 and they really decline. And I've never seen an athlete do 5. Never. I had Dr. Stephen Chong back. He was the exercise physiologist for the Canadian Olympic team. And he bet me he could do 5. And I said, you won't do 5. He said, if you give it an honest go, I used to coach him years ago. I said, if you do give me an honest go, you won't give me 5. And he's like, Tim, I can do it. And he's known for his suffering and all these heat and cold tests that he does and stuff like that. He couldn't do 5. There's a great measure. And then I'll repeat this with my athletes 3 or 4 times a year. It's a tough effort, but then I'll sometimes do it as a workout, and training is testing and testing is training. That is a powerful anaerobic workout. So when you're thinking about this idea of testing, then how do you build it? The reality is the SAD principle is really important here. Specific adaptation to impose demands. If we want to improve repeatability, right? We need big training load. You got to be fit enough to train this well and stuff like that. You don't need big training load, but you need to be fit. You have to have the right training load. Specificity is king queen here. It really is. You got to practice repeatability. You got to do short, hard intervals, and you got to do a lot of them. I see people who do short, hard intervals in the pursuit of power, and that's good. But at the end of the day, you got to build resiliency. You got to do a lot of them. Like to go out and do 4 times 1 minute isn't enough. It'll help maybe your anaerobic power some, because you can go a little harder for those 4, and that will maybe raise your anaerobic power, but it's going to have a much lesser impact on your resiliency, because if you want repeatability, you got to practice repeatability. And that idea becomes time in zone progression. So if you think about what we're talking about, these two things working together, we're talking about this idea that we need this consistent training. We need load, both are load training, load dependent. We need aerobic fitness, capacity and endurance as an underlying principle. We need the right rhythm of introducing those stimuli. And then we need interval progression, time and intensity progression. So again, I'll go back to the, just making the point, you see the pattern. We are building this in, but you don't see as much resiliency in the Basecamp program work, because it really is stuff you should be doing in the pre-competitive phase, because it's very fatiguing. You don't want to do that all year long. And we do a little bit of it, but you get it. Typical examples, I just gave you one. I use crit 6 rinse as, I like prescribing it as a workout. And then people say, oh, this is going to hurt so bad. And I'm said, no, I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. I'm going to be good. So it's easy for me to prescribe it, but man, no, I don't do it that much anymore. Other simple examples, descending anaerobic capacity intervals, 3 times 2 minutes, a little extra break, 3 times 1 minute, a little extra break, 3 times 30 seconds. AC Power Builders, 5 times 45 seconds with, I think these would have 150% recovery, could be 2 minutes recovery, lots of anaerobic work, this type of work, really manipulating the on-off time, the interval intensity and length, and the rest intensity and length all have impact. So it would be a lot of examples, but you get the point. You're doing hard for, and then a little recovery. You need to do, though, they all need to be a fair amount of them. Like for my higher end athletes, I'll prescribe this workout sometimes. It's not one of my favorites, but I have athletes who like it. It is impactful because it gets harder, shorter distance and higher power later. I would do 4 or 5 at 2 minutes, 6 at a minute, and maybe 6 to 9 at 30 seconds. Again, those are athletes training CTLs 125 to 150. So they're, obviously training a lot more, but you have to push each person has to find their breaking point and be right, hopefully before that, but there really is only one way to find it. Questions and answers. All right, you can drop them in now. I was trying to tackle as many as I could. So Greg, I think I answered a lot of your components about DFRC, so I'm going to take your question out if you don't mind. Re-ask it if I didn't, or if it brought up other questions, and Nimrita and I can get to it. Nimrita, you want to take one? You want to go back and forth?
Yeah, I'll take Michael because
Yeah, I'll take the one above him.
probably, yeah. How does the factors of hydration and nutrition affect recharge rate? So I'm going to say again, this is like sort of my opinion as I think through this, but not as much as you would think as it affects durability. So if you're specifically thinking about the recharge rate and you're doing anaerobic intervals, the amount of glycogen you have available is absolutely important, but you need to have that in the tank beforehand. So maximizing your muscle's ability to even store glycogen in the first place is important. And then eating enough carbohydrates so that you're going into the workout with high glycogen stores is important. But the workout is so short and fast that your muscle is not using what you're eating and drinking right then. It's using what's already available in the muscle. So you want to have the glycogen there. A couple other things that I think from a nutritional standpoint that would influence would be one, the phosphocreatine system. So in my other supplement nerdcast, I talked about supplementing creatine. If you are an anaerobic athlete, it's something you may want to consider, especially if you're older or vegetarian and you don't necessarily have the high ability or a large ability to store phosphocreatine as that, first go-to energy source. And then the other thing that has been kind of shown to maybe influence the recharge rate is the level of muscle carnosine. And again, if you don't eat a lot of meat, you might have lower than ideal levels if you, again, are an anaerobic athlete. That's where the supplement beta alanine comes in, because it'll increase your muscle carnosine levels. And what it's doing is, again, inside the muscle, it's acting as an intracellular buffer. So it's buffering that acidity, those hydrogen ions that are being formed and causing that local fatigue. But other than that, I'm trying to think in the workout, like if you're doing repeated efforts at the end, or if it's a long workout, like the crit sprints workout Tim showed that has longer intervals in between each set, there, I think it does, make a little bit more sense to take in the hydration and the carbohydrates during. So at least if nothing else, it's helping your mental ability to kind of stay in the game and produce those higher numbers later.
It also gives you something to throw up at the end. So,
yeah, that's the danger of it.
So just be careful. Mm-hmm. Excellently said. That was a great answer. Good insight. All right, I'll tackle Peter's. Peter asks, any way to get estimated of FRC while on a ride? There's a couple of apps that you can get in Garmin IQ that estimate it, but it's not as usable as you would think, because most of the time you're draining that pretty fast. You're not looking at the computer, and that ain't easy. But yeah, you could. You're so much better looking at it post and learning your patterns and understanding, what ranges you start to train in high and what workouts, you're probably better off that, and then coordinating that to feel and performance capability. I can't remember. The Garmin IQ has one app that does it off the CPW. I just can't remember the name of it at this time. I think Exert does it. That Exert is a model-based program, and I think they don't call it W, they have something else, but they might have an IQ app that does it also. You'll use it for a week and be like, I can't make sense of it. You're better off just looking at your data and building it into your mindset. I'll tackle Alex too. Can I compute my AWC by integrating my power duration curve? Is there something I can find in TP? Alex, you can do it in WKO software, which is very complex. If you don't have WKO already, I'd hesitate, unless you like data and complexity, and you see people using it in our group. But if you just enter your data, and as long as you have some maximal efforts, it would just tell you what it is. You can also go online and find CP, critical power calculators, and enter in some maximal numbers, and it would estimate yours. So you can just find it online for free. There's spreadsheets that will do it. There's like the critical power model has a mathematical problem. So there's like 5 or 6 versions of them. So, but they're all will give you enough insight to work from. The charts like I was showing here, that's, these are being done in WKO software. So it's not something live that's happening. You want to tackle Cindy's, or you want to do that together?
Yeah, maybe together. I mean, I'll give my thoughts. So Cindy asks, doing 3x10, 30/30s, is there a reason why the last 10 are actually easier than the first? So I guess I would question, what do you mean by easier? Like, are you producing more watts at the end in the last set of 30/30s than the first? If that's the case, then I don't think you're doing the first set hard enough. If the power is lower, but it feels easier, that could be all your like hormones and everything, your adrenaline, like everything's primed. And so for whatever reason, you're mentally perceiving that as lower RPE, even though your power is lower. And then there's the issue of like, how long are the recovery intervals in between the 3x10? And then Tim, I know you have thoughts on the 30-second recovery interval format. So go ahead.
Yeah, so Cindy, I'm not a fan of 30/30s. Actually, I am in certain ways, as long as you understand really what they're doing. I still wouldn't be a fan, to be honest with you, but understand their purpose. The 30-second recovery time is too long. So it's based on the Tabata exercises, tests, and what he did in his experiments. And the reality is, once you go beyond a 20-second recovery time frame, you're changing the dynamics of what's happening in there. So if you're doing threshold interval that work way, so you're using that impulse approach, maybe, and I could see that. But if you're doing anything to push that, and you're not going to do much more for 10 minutes. I mean, it's going to end up, you probably average around threshold. I would rather see you do that impulse in 40/20 or 20/20 and just do more, right? Take your 10 minutes. I think you'd find it more effective. I agree with everything though Amrita said and have nothing to add. And that's just, to me, I think the recovery, it's an opinion based in pretty good science. Read the original Tabata research and what he was looking at and what he tested, because he had test failures, and all the failure came at longer recovery rates. All right, I'll tackle this last one. For someone under, say, 40 years old, not me, how big of an increase have you seen over seasons? So I assume you mean anaerobic work capacity as a whole. It could be anywhere from 5 to 15%. You tend to be born with a lot of that. I'm interested in Amrita's answer. The genetics will play a little bit side there, because it'll have an impact on your fiber type again. And fiber type here is the driver of everything happening. So the other thing though, it's interesting. I've seen some studies on track riders do much better, but they do much better in developing anaerobic work capacity, but might not have the resiliency. So there is a point where those two ideas might split. Do a lot of weight training, bulk up, put on, you know, a lot of fast twitch fiber, focus on force velocity, strength development, and you might actually measure a bigger AWC, but actually less ability to really bring it to bear in a resilient way because of the high specificity of what they're doing. That's the right thing they should be doing on the track. It's just odd. But I would say the normal good focus range would be 5 to 15%. So Brian's follow-up question is, develop AWC at the expense of bulking up muscle to increase creatine? No, they purposely bulk up to put out more power and have a bigger AWC. If I understand the right question. More fast twitch fiber is absolutely a way to produce Pmax power. Then as you train at those higher levels, you're bringing up your anaerobic work capacity. And again, I don't know if it's a chicken or an egg. That's such a weird little, very highly specific world that happens there because, you know, it's so funny. It still has an aerobic basis. And so they need some aerobic training, but most of those track people, you're like, what's your FTP? And they're like, dude, I don't ride my bike for more than 20 minutes. You know, they're just, so you just don't quite know. Awesome. I think that means we've got all the questions. Thanks everybody for joining us. The advanced ones always go a little long, so sorry about that, but hopefully everybody found a couple of nuggets and that you see, and I should have put it as last slide, there's more to the fitness than your FTP. We're building FTP, durability, resiliency, and skills, working on your mental skills, working on your biomechanics and things like that, continuing to focus on you being the whole athlete. So in your next FTP test, know that it's more than just that number. Your performance is being built in different ways, and we're driving for success. Thanks for coming, everybody. We will get this posted by tomorrow morning. Thanks,
Bye.
Rita.